The rhythmic beep of the heart monitor was a cold metronome counting the seconds of his failure. For 40 years, General Samuel Jones commanded armies and moved mountains. But he couldn't protect his own son from this. The antiseptic smell of the ICU was a sterile mask for the raw, metallic scent of injustice that clung to the air. Maria Jones sat beside the hospital bed, her body a rigid statue of grief. Every beep of the machine monitoring her son's heart was a fresh stab in her own. Leo, her vibrant, laughing 17-year-old, lay still and broken, lost beneath a constellation of tubes and wires. His face, usually so full of life and quick to smile, was a swollen, discolored ruin. His passion was art. His hands, which could coax life onto a canvas with a few strokes of charcoal, were now limp and unresponsive on the white sheets. Standing behind her, a silent, imposing figure, was her father, General Samuel Jones. At 65, his posture was still as unyielding as the oak tree in their backyard. 40 years in the United States Army, culminating in a 4-star rank, had forged him into a man of discipline and quiet command. He had advised presidents, navigated the labyrinth of the Pentagon, and stared down enemies of the state. But here, in this hushed, sterile room, he was powerless. His gaze was fixed on his grandson, but his mind, a machine honed for strategy, was already processing intelligence. He noted the precise angle of the contusion on Leo's temple, the pattern of bruising on his arms, the slight tremor in his own daughter's hands. This wasn't a random accident. This was an enemy action. A young, tear-streaked girl, Leo's classmate, had recounted the events to them in a trembling voice just an hour earlier. Leo had been outside their high school, sketching the architecture of the old building for a project. 2 officers, Talbot and Kenny, had pulled up. They saw a black teenager in a hoodie and saw a threat. "What are you casing, kid?" one had sneered. Leo, ever polite, had tried to explain, showing them his sketchbook. They saw his explanation as defiance. They slammed him against the brick wall. The girl said Leo never raised a hand, never even raised his voice. He just kept saying, "I'm just drawing." It didn't matter. They saw his compliance as weakness. The final, sickening thud of his head against the pavement had silenced his pleas. Now, hours later, General Jones walked into the 12th Precinct station. Maria walked beside him, her face set like stone. The general wore a simple, worn tweed jacket over a plain collared shirt, looking more like a retired history professor than a man who once commanded the most powerful military force on earth. Captain Hastings, a man whose gut hung over his belt and whose eyes held the weary cynicism of a bureaucrat, met them in the lobby. He listened to Maria's clipped, precise account with a placid, dismissive air. "Ma'am, we have a report of an officer-involved incident," Hastings said, his tone oozing condescension. "Your son was resisting arrest. We'll conduct a full internal investigation, but these things take time." Maria's hands clenched. Resisting? He was drawing. There were witnesses. Hastings sighed, a performative display of patience. "Everyone's a witness, ma'am. And everyone has a story. We have ours, your son has his." The general, who had been silent until now, spoke. His voice was quiet, almost gentle, yet it cut through the station's din like a razor. "Captain," he began, his eyes locking onto Hastings, "my grandson is in a medically induced coma. He does not have a story right now. He has a tube down his throat." Hastings shifted his gaze to the old man, sizing him up and dismissing him in the same instant. "Look, Pop, I understand you're upset. But we have procedures. The department will handle it." "The department," the general repeated softly, the words tasting like ash. He gave a slow, deliberate nod, not of agreement, but of assessment. He had identified the enemy commander. He had seen the fortified position. And he knew, with the chilling certainty of 1,000 battles, that procedure would not bring justice. He placed a hand on his daughter's arm. "Maria. We're done here." As they walked out into the cold evening air, Maria felt a wave of despair. "Dad, what do we do? They don't care." General Jones stopped and looked at her, his eyes no longer filled with a grandfather's grief, but with a commander's resolve. "They made a mistake, Maria," he said, his voice a low rumble. "They saw a broken family. They should have seen a chain of command." The scent of old paper and leather in General Jones's bookstore, the gilded page, had always been a comfort to Maria. Now, it was a fortress. The small, cluttered shop, with its floor-to-ceiling shelves of military history and classic literature, became his war room. While Maria coordinated with doctors and sat by Leo's bedside, the general began his campaign. His first call was to a number he hadn't dialed in 3 years. It was answered on the first ring. "Sir," the voice on the other end was a gravelly baritone, instantly recognizable. "Bulldog," the general said, the old call sign feeling foreign and familiar at once. "General Jones. I was sorry to hear about your grandson. I'm on a plane." There was no need for explanation, no preamble. That was the bond between a general and his former command sergeant major. Marcus "Bulldog" Riley had been the general's shadow for 15 years, from the sands of Iraq to the mountains of Afghanistan. Where the general was the strategist, Bulldog was the implementer, a master of logistics, intelligence, and getting things done. He now ran a highly successful, and discreet, private security and intelligence firm in D.C. "I need a full workup, Bulldog," the general said, his voice low. "Officers Brent Talbot and Raymond Kenny. Captain Drew Hastings. The whole 12th Precinct. I want to know where they eat, where they sleep, who they owe, and what sins they've buried. I want a complete battlefield picture. Consider it done, sir. ETA is 0600. By sunrise, the bookstore's back office was transformed. Bulldog, a mountain of a man with kind eyes and hands the size of dinner plates, had set up a secure network on a series of encrypted laptops. Maps of the city were on an easel, not with troop movements, but with the patrol routes and known associates of the officers. The enemy was no longer a faceless department, it was a network of individuals with weaknesses to be exploited. "They're sloppy, General," Bulldog reported, pointing to a screen. "Talbot has 2 prior excessive force complaints, both dismissed. Kenny was named in a racial profiling lawsuit that the city settled out of court. Hastings signed off on both dismissals. This isn't a case of 2 bad apples. The whole damn orchard is rotten." The general absorbed the information, his face grim. "They're arrogant. They believe they're untouchable. We need to shatter that belief. It's time for the first strike. Phase 1, isolate and expose." He turned to Maria, who had just arrived with a thermos of coffee, her eyes hollow from a sleepless night. "Maria," he said gently. "They see you as a victim. I need them to see you as a threat. We're going to speak to the world. They didn't go to the press. That would allow the department to control the narrative. Instead, Bulldog's team set up a single camera in the bookstore. The backdrop was a wall of leather-bound books, symbols of knowledge and truth. Maria sat in a simple wooden chair. The general stood just behind her, out of focus but undeniably present, his hands resting on the back of her chair. His presence was a silent endorsement, a shadow of immense power. Maria looked directly into the lens, her voice trembling but clear. "My name is Maria Jones. My son, Leo, is 17 years old. He loves art, he's an honor student, and he has never been in trouble in his life." Her voice cracked, but she pushed on. 3 days ago, he was beaten into a coma by 2 officers of the Baltimore Police Department. They said he was resisting arrest. This is what he was resisting with. She held up his sketchbook. Its pages were filled with beautiful, intricate drawings of cityscapes and portraits. They didn't see a boy. They saw a target, she continued, her voice gaining strength. They serve under a department that has taught them that some lives matter less than others. They wear a uniform and carry an oath to protect and serve. I know something about oaths. She paused, taking a breath. The general had helped her craft this part. My father served this country for 40 years. He taught me that an oath is a sacred promise. That a uniform is not a shield for brutality, but a symbol of public trust. That trust has been broken. That oath has been betrayed. We are not asking for justice. We are demanding it. Bulldog uploaded the video to a dozen different platforms simultaneously. Within an hour, it had 10,000 views. By evening, it had 1 million. The hashtag Justice for Leo was trending. The war had begun. The video hit the 12th precinct like a tactical missile. Panic spread faster than the city's notoriously bad coffee. Captain Hastings' phone rang off the hook. The chief was screaming. The mayor's office was demanding answers. Who the hell is this woman? Hastings roared, slamming his office door. And who's the old guy standing behind her like some damn sentinel? A junior analyst, tasked with running a background check, suddenly went pale. He walked into Hastings' office, holding a printout as if it were radioactive. Sir, he stammered. The father. The old man. You're not going to believe this. Hastings snatched the paper. He read the name first, General Samuel T. Jones. Then the summary below it, U.S. Army, retired. Final rank, General, 4-star. Former Commander, U.S. Central Command. Recipient of the Distinguished Service Cross, 2 Purple Hearts, and a Bronze Star. The coffee cup slipped from Hastings' hand, shattering on the floor. They hadn't just assaulted a random teenager. They had kicked a hornet's nest woven from the highest echelons of the U.S. military. The fear in the room was palpable. Arrogance curdled into dread. The department's counterattack was swift and dirty. They couldn't attack the general's record directly, it was too formidable. So they dug for something they could twist. They found it, a classified operation from 20 years prior, a difficult call the general had made that resulted in friendly fire casualties. It was a tragedy he carried with him every day. The department's union rep, a man with connections to a notoriously partisan news outlet, leaked a heavily redacted, out-of-context summary of the incident. The headline read, Hero, General's Bloody Past, Did a Fatal Command Decision Show a Pattern of Recklessness? They were trying to paint him as a hypocrite, a man with blood on his hands criticizing officers for making a split-second decision. The public attacks were matched by a more direct approach. That night, Officer Talbot, the more volatile of the 2 cops, was given an off-the-books assignment by a panicked Hastings. We need to know what they have, Hastings had told him. Get inside. Plant a bug. Find leverage. Talbot, emboldened by a false sense of impunity, crept through the back alley behind Maria's house, where the general was now staying. He jimmied a window, slipped inside, and found himself in the dark kitchen. He took 2 steps before the world erupted in a disorienting blast of light and sound. A 130 decibel siren shrieked, and strobe lights flashed with blinding intensity. Talbot stumbled, disoriented, his night vision destroyed. Before he could even draw his weapon, a massive shadow detached itself from the darkness. Bulldog Riley, who had been waiting patiently, tackled Talbot with the force of a freight train, driving him to the floor. A knee pressed into his back, and his hands were expertly zip-tied behind him. The system Bulldog had installed wasn't a commercial alarm, it was a military-grade counter-intrusion system. Motion sensors, pressure plates, and thermal cameras had tracked Talbot from the moment he stepped on the property. As the shrieking alarm finally died down, the kitchen lights flicked on. General Jones stood in the doorway, wearing a simple bathrobe, a phone in his hand. He wasn't looking at the pathetic, writhing form of Officer Talbot. He was looking at the small, discreet camera mounted in the corner of the ceiling, its red recording light glowing steadily. Bulldog, the general said calmly. Call 911. And then call our friend at the FBI. Tell him an active duty police officer has committed a felony by breaking into the home of a retired federal officer. I believe that elevates the jurisdiction." Talbot's blood ran cold. This wasn't a game anymore. This was a rout. The image of a uniformed Baltimore police officer being led in handcuffs from the home of a four-star general was the lead story on every national morning show. The department's attempt to smear the general had backfired spectacularly, transforming their narrative from "tragic mistake" to "malicious conspiracy." General Jones and Maria held a press conference on the steps of City Hall. Maria, no longer just a grieving mother but a figure of immense moral authority, spoke first. "Yesterday," she began, her voice ringing with cold fury, "the Baltimore Police Department tried to attack my father's honor. Last night, they sent one of the men who beat my son to break into my home. This is not the action of a department seeking truth. This is the action of a criminal enterprise trying to silence its victims. They have failed." Then the general stepped to the microphone. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. "I have served the United States for my entire adult life," he said, his gaze sweeping over the sea of cameras. "I have sent young men and women into harm's way, and I have mourned their loss. The incident my service record is being used to attack was the greatest tragedy of my command. I carry that weight every day. But it was a tragedy born of the fog of war, in service to this nation. What happened to my grandson was an act of brutal cowardice, born of hatred, in betrayal of this city. There is no comparison. And for this department to use my service as a shield for their corruption is an insult to every soldier who has ever worn a uniform." The war escalated on multiple fronts. While the media focused on the press conference, the general's real offensive was happening in the shadows. He made 3 calls. The first was to the chairman of the Senate Armed Services Committee, an old friend. The second was to a deputy director at the Department of Justice he'd worked with on counterterrorism. The third was to the editor-in-chief of the New York Times. He didn't ask for favors. He simply stated the facts and said, "This is an infection in one of our great cities. It needs sunlight." Simultaneously, Bulldog's team delivered a package to the FBI. They had spent days piecing together digital breadcrumbs, and with the help of a white-hat hacker who owed Bulldog a favor, they had gained access to a trove of deleted emails from the precinct server. Among them was the smoking gun, a chain of messages between Captain Hastings and the Union rep, explicitly discussing the plan to leak the general's military record. The final email from Hastings was chilling: "We need to bury him and the mother under this. Make sure the narrative sticks." The FBI, now under pressure from the DOJ, had no choice but to act. A formal federal investigation was launched, not just into the assault on Leo, but into a pattern of corruption, evidence tampering, and civil rights violations within the 12th precinct. The city-level problem had metastasized into a federal crisis. The walls Hastings had built to protect his men were now a cage, and the general was calmly, methodically, locking the door. The federal courtroom was a pressure cooker. On one side sat the U.S. Attorney's team, armed with a mountain of evidence provided by the general's shadow operation. On the other, Captain Hastings and Officers Talbot and Kenny sat with their union-appointed lawyers, their faces a mixture of defiance and ill-concealed terror. The prosecution's case was a masterpiece of strategic execution. They began with the emotional core. A nurse from the hospital took the stand, tearfully recounting how she overheard Talbot and Kenny in the hallway, laughing that Leo was lucky they didn't finish the job. The testimony sent a wave of revulsion through the courtroom. Next, they established the cover-up, presenting the leaked emails and the evidence from the foiled break-in. But the killing blow came when the prosecution called its final witness. The United States calls General Samuel T. Jones to the stand. A hush fell over the room as the general, dressed in a sharp, dark suit that might as well have been a uniform, walked to the witness box. He was not sworn in as a victim's relative, but as an expert witness on command, ethics, and use of force protocols. The prosecutor began. "General, you have commanded thousands of soldiers. Could you explain to the court the principle of command responsibility? For 30 minutes, the general gave a masterclass. He spoke in calm, measured tones about accountability, the chain of command, and the absolute necessity of integrity in any uniformed service. He didn't speak of his grandson, but of the principles his grandson's attackers had violated. When an officer uses excessive force, the general explained, it is a failure not only of that individual, but of his training, his supervision, and his leadership. When that failure is covered up, it ceases to be a failure and becomes a conspiracy. It poisons the entire organization. The defense attorney, a famously aggressive lawyer, tried to challenge him on cross-examination. "General, isn't it true that officers, like soldiers, must make split-second decisions in dangerous situations?" The general's eyes narrowed. "I have made decisions that cost lives, counselor. And for every single one, I was held accountable by my superiors, by my government, and by my own conscience. That is the burden of command. The difference is, my dangerous situations were in active war zones against armed combatants. Officer Talbot's and Kenny's dangerous situation was an unarmed 17-year-old boy holding a sketchbook. To compare the two is an offense to every soldier who has ever faced true danger." The lawyer had no follow-up. He sat down, defeated. The checkmate was complete. The jury was out for less than 2 hours. Guilty on all counts: excessive force, conspiracy, obstruction of justice. As Hastings was led away in handcuffs, his eyes met the general's for a fleeting moment. He saw no triumph in the old soldier's gaze. Only a profound, weary sadness. 2 days after the verdict, Leo Jones opened his eyes. The first person he saw was his mother, Maria, her face awash with tears of relief. The second was his grandfather, who squeezed his hand gently. "Welcome back, soldier," the general whispered. The fall of the 12th Precinct's leadership was only the beginning. Under federal pressure, the Baltimore Police Department underwent the most significant restructuring in its history. A new civilian oversight board was established. Dozens of officers with histories of complaints were fired. The Leo Justice Act, a state bill mandating automatic, independent investigation of any police brutality claim involving a minor, was passed unanimously. Months later, Leo was back in the bookstore, his sketchbook open on his lap. He was still healing, but the spark was back in his eyes. He looked at his grandfather, who was quietly reshelving a book on the Civil War. "Grandpa," Leo asked, "was it worth it? The whole war?" General Jones paused, turning to his grandson. He walked over and sat beside him, his gaze drifting to the bustling city street outside the window. "A soldier's job isn't just to win wars, Leo," he said softly. "It's to fight for the possibility of peace. A peace where a young man can sit and draw without fear. As long as that peace is worth fighting for, it's worth it." He put an arm around his grandson's shoulders, the general and the artist, guardians of a peace they had fought for together. A soldier fights for the flag, but a general fights for the ideals it represents. General Jones reminded an entire city what those ideals are. If you believe true strength lies in protecting the vulnerable, comment respect below. Subscribe and share to honor all who serve with integrity.